world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. I'm thrilled to be joined by Brian Roemmele today. Brian is the consummate Renaissance man. He's a scientist, researcher, analyst, connector, thinker, and doer. More than anything, I found Brian to be an observer of the world, asking questions and following his seemingly infinite curiosity to the root of an astounding variety of issues. Over the long, winding arc of his career, Brian has built and run payments and tech businesses, worked in media, including the promotion of top musicians, and explored a variety of other subjects along the way. Brian actively shares his findings and observations across fora like Medium, Quora, Twitter, and his own podcast, Around the Coin. Brian is one of the most prolific producers of top-quality analytical content I've ever encountered. I would highly encourage everyone to follow Brian and actively consume the information he puts out. Brian, welcome to Rebank.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really, really happy to be here today.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about your background, specifically your work in payments.
Well, I fell into payments accidentally. I didn't ever plan to want to do this as a career. Banking was probably the last thing on my mind as a young guy. I fell into it because I wrote some software, which is now known as a point-of-sale system back in the 1980s, primarily. Actually, 1970s is when it starts. I sold it in the 1980s. It was a product called Ashton Tate, and it was a database software. And I was working with a group of folks at a Computerland store in New Jersey. It was just outside of Princeton. And they asked me, they said, we have a client that came in. It's an auto parts store, and they have, I think it was 197,000 SKUs or products, which was kind of small. I thought they had more parts. And they wanted to be able to catalog it and have it available at the cash register. I think, well, that's pretty easy. I can get a PC to do that. And they looked at me kind of funny, and I said, yeah, give me a weekend. I'll throw something together. So I built, on top of Ashton Tate, a database which is essentially tracking their parts, a barcode reading system using, at that time, 3 out of 9 barcode technology, which is not the UPC, because UPCs were not even a commonality at that point, especially in auto parts. You just didn't have it. So we created the system. I worked with a couple of my friends because I was getting kind of bored on some of the subroutines. So we created the system, a good friend of mine, to print out barcodes because there weren't any barcodes. And that was fun. And it took off. It was really a surprise to the owner because I naturally assumed they knew everything they had in inventory. It turned out the commonality at that time was nobody really knew exactly how many they had of product X, Y, or Z. Only maybe the 10th percentile of the products were ever really accounted for. The rest were just growing dust motes in the back, and therefore it was relatively not available. So they would literally say, we don't have that part, even though it was sitting in the back somewhere. People just lost the cataloging capability or the desire to look for it. And nobody ever wanted to go back in inventory, so these stores would grow enormous. They would move them from larger and larger to larger and larger facilities. So we did this, and they implemented it at, I think it was 45 locations. They grew to 100 and some odd locations. Other people found out about it, and the next thing I knew, I was building point-of-sale system for a whole lot of people. Inside of that point-of-sale, I created a simulation of a credit card machine called a Verifone Zon Jr. And the Verifone Zon Jr. was the first very popular credit card machine. There were those that came before, but the Zon revolutionized it because it made it much more efficient, much more popular. And even though I knew the Z80 processor was at play inside, and I was machine language expert at that moment of time for 6502s and Z80s, because that's pretty much the only way you could have gotten really complex things done. I didn't want to do that. So I black boxed it. And black box is very simple. You look at the inputs and you look at the outputs and you simulate it. So I simulated that in software. And it would dial up a phone number, transfer the credit card information, get the approval, and shut it down. Apparently, that was revolutionary. I thought it was being done all over the place. I was as a kid. I didn't know any better. And next thing I started getting was phone calls from credit card processing companies offering me $1,000 a lead. And I'm like, wow, there must be a lot of money in that business. So long story short, Ashton Tate offered to buy my operation, which I laughingly didn't even think was a company. It was just a bunch of friends building code. And although we did have quite a few thousands of customers, it was just kind of fun, you know. And I at first, the numbers they threw at me were insane. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I don't believe you. And later on, they quadrupled it and then quadrupled that again. And I go, wow, they must really be serious. So I finally sold it. They summarily did nothing with it after that. They maintained the customers, but nothing happened. And the guy that championed the acquisition left the company and retired. So nobody remembered why they bought it or what they did with it. But I took the money and got out of Jersey and moved to Southern California. And at the same time, I got extremely intrigued about the credit card business from a merchant's perspective. Now, I had thought up until that point, well, prior to that point, I was going to be a physicist. You know, I unofficially attended some classes at Princeton University. I was working with people whose parents were at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. I loved Einstein. I loved guys like David Bohm who would come out. You know, I would attend lectures there. And I said, this is my life. I could barely communicate. Wouldn't look at you. I was just a shy kind of guy. I just wanted to be in the back lab researching. So the software thing kind of drew me out. And then the merchant thing really drew me out, you know, created the Frankenstein you hear today. Over years of talking to merchants, I really got into this. I decided, you know, I'm going to play around with this. I'm going to try to see if I can innovate around this idea of credit cards. And it was just starting up. The whole concept of the credit card was taking off in this era, and it was widely available. Obviously, it was invented in the 1950s initially, but the banking infrastructure, the Bank AmeriCard system, and the MasterCard system were just in its infancy, and it was a rebellious and tumultuous time. And bankers failed miserably at communicating to merchants their need to accept credit cards, and I loved the challenge. So in that epoch, I taught myself to walk into businesses, for example, a restaurant at an airport, and I'd look at the back wall with what they would call the wall of shame. These were checks that people bounced. Now, today you would probably get arrested for putting those checks up there, but it was a common sight. I have pictures of this. Common sight of the wall of shame. These are people who came in, bought some food, left on a flight, and bounced a check. And so the owners would say, okay, I'll put you up on a wall of shame so everybody else can see you're a deadbeat. That's the concept anyway. So I'd sit down with these folks and say, you know, if you accepted credit cards like this American Express or this, you know, Bank AmeriCard, you wouldn't have this problem. And it turns out about 20, maybe 25% of the people walking around this airport right now have it in their pocket, and they probably would not stiff you on a check. No, I don't need that. So the struggle was difficult. Today it's, you know, taken for granted. Oh, of course you're going to accept credit cards. Back then it wasn't. Then it was, how were you going to accept those credit cards? Prior to the electronic credit card acceptance systems, you would take the credit card receipts with the full credit card number, stick them into envelopes, mail them out, and wait 27 to 60 days to get paid. And they would literally send you a check in the mail, and then you have to wait for that to clear. So needless to say, merchants were not extremely motivated to wait sometimes 2 months to get paid. We changed that. What I mean by we is those of us who trailblazed the idea of electronic credit card acceptance. Again, taken for granted. Today it's, oh, God, that industry is a dinosaur. Yeah, it became a dinosaur because the lack of innovation that typically takes place in the banking realm. And we're seeing it today. Upstarts and disruptors and crazy people wind up moving the banking system ahead. It's always coming from some crazy fringe element. Everybody points at and laughs at. So that's what the ISOs were. That's what they called the third-party resellers for the credit card system. That's what they were considered.
So for a while, you were
stage.
onboarding merchants effectively, and that led into
Yes.
kind of more work around merchant acquiring and payment processing, which has led you, at least in kind of your payments work, to where we are today. And I understand that you do a fair bit of kind of whether it's paid consultancy work or pro bono work around some newer players in kind of the payment space. Where's payments today, and what's some of the work you're doing in payments at the moment?
Well, yes, I don't have a card that says consultant or advisor, but I do a lot of that, and I do it, sometimes paid and a lot of times not paid. I'll just publish. I have a premise that I give at least 5% of what I know at any given time, and that's a moving window. As more things get revealed on the directionality of technology or banking, I'll reveal more. So my 5% window opens wider, but then I learn more and then it closes down a little bit more. So we're in that push-pull type of environment. So yeah, I do that privately. I try to consult and advise. Sadly, some of it is outlandish and not able to be digested at the time. Even with very young and disruptive companies, it's very hard to understand just how dramatically the rate of change is going to accelerate. Fundamentally, we're not designed to accept this rapid rate of change, but it's coming about so much faster, and it's centered around payments and funds and money and how we order and how we interact. So where I'm at today is really what I try to distill down into voice first, voice commerce, and voice payments. And those terminologies are invented by me because of the 140 character limit of Twitter. I'm not going to say conversational converse or smart speaker or Internet of Things. So, yeah, what I'm doing is what I started doing in the mid-'80s. I created a voice synthesizer board for the Commodore VIC-20 and later Commodore 64. And it was my beginning journey. Here's another thread of payments and technology, or voice this time. I said to myself, by 1989, I built this board. I sold what my friends say thousands. It's a blur out of our garages as kids in Jersey. And at the moment in time when I finally recognized what we were doing, I decided, and it was kind of after it all, the Commodore was moving away and the PC era was developing. Mac had come out and stuff. And by 89, I developed what I call the Voice Manifesto. It was actually voiced asterisk. I was going to replace it with something. It's this manifesto. And it's now 800 odd pages with thousands of research documents to support it. And it's basically my thinking about not just commerce, but the directionality of how we're going to interact with our computer. And it has a long trajectory that started with punch cards. Punch cards are so much faster than typists. And in the punch card era, if I told you that typists are going to replace punch card machines, you would laugh in my face if you were a computer expert. You say, that's preposterous, Brian. You're a conspiracy theorist. You're some kind of crazy guy. You're wrapped up in some kind of, fantasy world. A typist will never be that fast. And by the way, I will never type on a computer. That's manual labor. And of course, that was true for a while. They had typists to do that. The computer engineers at a time wouldn't lower themselves to typing. This is not fiction. It's the way it was back then. And that's why we see a lot of IBM pictures. You will see certain individuals that they've chosen. Many of them at the time were considered very pretty. I think they're very pretty today, sitting down at a keyboard while the computer scientists directed the manual typist. That is absurd today. Absolutely absurd, of course. And not so much because of the juxtaposition of role models and genders and all that. No, it was common in that era.
Well, sometimes I wish someone would type for me on my, 4-inch iPhone keyboard, which is sometimes more difficult than it should be.
Well, that's precisely the issue. We humans, for hundreds and thousands of years, developed our vocal cords and our hardwired brain function to communicate not through our fingers, but through our vocal inflections. And that's why whenever you need to deliver something important to a significant other, not only you're doing a couple of things. You look at me. That's it. Look at my eyes. I need to tell you something. And you're saying it with your voice if you're blessed to have the ability to speak. And nothing is going to replace that power anytime soon, as long as the human mind is wired the way it is. So this little side trip that we took with the keyboard was because computers couldn't understand us. So we had to try to be more like the computer. And now we're finally at the inflection point where the computer can start to really reasonably understand us through AI. Or voice-assisted AI is really what voice first is about. Voice first is a concept where you're not putting an appendage on the operating system, but you're building the operating system, the entire computer experience from a voice interaction first environment, like mobile first was to the web. And it's still hard for many of my colleagues, especially experts, to deal with this. Some things will be that way, of course, but my claim is 50% of all computer interactions will be voice assisted AI or voice first in 10 years.
And I guess part of the reason this is able to happen is because we're no longer kind of doing all our processing on the devices. It's actually sitting somewhere in the cloud, and so your voice is kind of piped out into the stratosphere where it's being analyzed by server systems, which then push the answers back to the local device. Well,
precisely. So the convergence that I looked at in 1989 was Moore's law would have a very, very difficult time getting to the point where the device would be fast enough to not only, understand your natural language without training. I mean, you got to remember, for most of voice's history, we had to train our devices to understand us, just our voice, and a few words. You would read long paragraphs of stories, and the more you read, the better it understood. Those days are gone. The algorithms are 98% precise. Now the biggest challenge is intent extraction, and that's a lot of heavy lifting. What is the intent of that sentence? And then operating on the intent is another layer of complexity. But the cloud, for example, Alexa isn't really processing your voice. The Amazon Echo Alexa system, it's recording your voice and sending it to AWS, Amazon's cloud. And thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of computers are working on bits of that to break it down and to instantaneously respond to you in a magical way. When you look at the complexity involved, it's absolutely mind-blowing. But it's happening, and it's happening right at this moment. But, it still is remarkably bad when it doesn't know what you're saying, when the intent extraction isn't working, or the microphone systems. Like, for example, Siri. One of the biggest problems with Siri in misunderstanding us is it doesn't have a far-field microphone system like, for example, Alexa does. These are beamforming far-field systems that are noise-correcting and calibrating your voice nanosecond by nanosecond so that it can really lock on to your voice and what you're saying. With Siri, if you just start muffling your voice or moving it away, it's lost. And that's because it was designed initially just to be something that would execute small commands. See, the Q&A, or the small command execution concept of voice, is the archaic age. A question and answer is the next level from command. The command is turn on my computer, or enter stop now, or something like that. Question and answer is what time is it and what's the weather.
So I get the power of voice around sending a message to your home thermostat remotely to turn up the temperature or to turn the lights on and off. But things like payments require the integration of a whole number of components, and they also require things like user authentication and all sorts of KYC and AML concerns. Yes. Does that complicate the use of voice in things like payments and commerce?
In a marvelous way. It complicates it to such a level. It's going to create the gold rush opportunity of our epoch, in my view, the convergence of AI and payments and voice. in commerce is all going to radically rejigger our landscape of how we interact with shopping and buying and banking and financial experiences in ways that I think many people who have even thought about this as computer scientists for a long time may be shocked. I think you really need to take a much grander view from anthropology and psychology and the whole history of humanity and apply that here, because computer science alone is going to give you a very dull tool to extract what's really going to happen. We're already seeing it in its very, very crude form in Alexa. I can say, Alexa, reorder paper towels. Now let's really look at that phrase and see how powerful that is. What we've done is we've debranded a product potentially. Now, I'm going to show you some of the people who are impacted or some of the entities that are impacted here. We've debranded the product. Well, paper towels, that's a generic term. That's right. What does that mean to you as a user? What does it mean to you as a manufacturer? What does it mean to you as the company that's going to sell that to the user? And in some tangential way, but meaningful ultimately, what does it mean to the distribution system that's built around this, the logistics? When you take a step back and you start really analyzing it, you recognize that we're fundamentally going to change every aspect of buying. Now, you might say, well, why not make that a subscription and automatic buying? Why not? Could have done that 75 years ago. Could have done it 100 years ago. Sears Catalog tried to do that. It's not new. Subscription marketing is not new. Problem is, human psychology denies us from wanting that experience. I can go into thousands of hours explaining that. Certain things may be a good subscription, but most aren't. And I don't think humanity is going to change that much significantly. We haven't in 150,000 years. I don't think we're going to do it in the next 20 years. Mm-hmm. So then it's on demand. And so Amazon had an answer for on demand. It's called the dash button. And that's fundamentally flawed. How many dash buttons are you going to have? Why do you want so many? And what's the cognitive load on a dash button? When you have 10 of them, is it convenient anymore? When you have 20 of them, that level of complexity becomes untenable and it becomes ridiculous. And we take a step back and you say, what is the better interface for that type of commerce? Now, this is only one element of commerce. And a lot of people get stuck here and say, that's where it's going to stay, Brian. Just commodity items, that's it. And then, sure, if you want to look at the world through that lens, it's not going to stop there. It's going to go on to levels of complexity. What's going to happen is we're going to start with things like that. Reorder the paper towels, buy, red wine vinegar. And, you may be Q&A'd on that. Now, I argue that Q&A is the wrong way to approach this.
i.e. Amazon asking you which brand, what size bottle,
that's right.
That sort of thing? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's interactive voice response 2.0 on your electronic device. That's voice tree systems that you and I hang up on, and because we get frustrated, even from technology. We all press 0, right? How many people are listening to me right now? They get a voicemail system. Press 1. You just press the 0. Get out of here. You press the pound sign. And so, yes, that's why people get mad at me, because their relativity, their cultural relativity of this is IVR. And I'm like, yeah, if you get IVR, I'm going to throw it out the window. No, what I'm talking about is dialogues, and that it implies intelligence. And of course, this is all about artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that means I call it your artificial intelligent assistant, or your personal assistant, or your, interactive assistant. I don't like using those terms, and that's why I keep throwing different ones around, because they already have baggage. But the idea is, in this world, we're going to be dealing with a little bit more of revealing ourselves, and this is going to be part of that KYC and privacy issues and all those other things that are going to compound at this epoch. And that is, the better your personal assistant knows you, the better it can help formalize a dialogue with you to make complex decisions simple, because that's what computers are here to do. The computers are not here to show us 1,000 Google searches, right? We're not here to mechanically go through page after page. what we're going to do is let our intelligent agents and our intelligent assistants, and I can get into the difference between the two, but they're minor at this point. They're going to do the mediation for us. There's something I call social signaling, and social signaling is a system I've been using in my own voice-first research. There's a number of signaling systems. I'm only going to talk about maybe one or two right now. The rest I try to keep proprietary. There's over 100, unfortunately, and some of them are esoteric and some of them very useful. So in social signaling, you can derive a great deal of information just by polling the people, not that you follow necessarily, the people that you've actually interact with quite a bit. And you can find a tremendous amount of information from Yelp reviews, what they've said on Facebook, what they've said on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat even, and wind up in real time utilizing that data to help formalize opinions. Sometimes using that direct social signaling, like saying, Bob really likes this brand of razor. And I use razor as a good example because one morning I went up to my voice AI systems that I designed and I said, I think I need a new razor. And that was it. That was the intent extraction. I need a new razor. It went out and it found that the bevel razor system from Walker Brands was a good choice. Now, I happen to know Tristan Walker quite well. We've spoke quite a bit, and I love what he's doing. So it wasn't that much a surprise.
And that's based on reviews? That's based on information that it gleaned through other kind of online sources?
All sorts of things were built into these neurons, if you will. All sorts of signaling. Not just because one person said they loved it. All sorts of things. But not only did it find that item, it found where I can buy it and where I can buy it cheaply and effectively that fit my particular modality. I wound up getting it at Target, and it works brilliantly. And that was a good example of how a new shopping experience will happen. If you notice, I didn't do a Google search. I didn't see a pay-per-click ad, and I didn't filter through a whole lot of images. Now, did it give me an image? Yes, I could look at any screen that happened to be close to me, and it knows which screens are close to me with the algorithms I'm using and the location awareness, and I can look at it. But this fantasy that we need to look at everything we're going to buy is not very realistic.
Well, this has interesting implications on commerce more broadly, because not only does this replace the likes of the way Google search works or maybe an Amazon search works, but it also has even greater implications for retailers who aren't currently online. Because currently you get people that prefer to shop in person, and therefore you get mom and pop retailers who may not be necessarily reliant on e-commerce on the web to the extent they otherwise could be. But if you move to this sort of paradigm that you're describing, effectively anyone who isn't hyper-connected from an online standpoint gets cut out.
Well, you are 100% accurate. In fact, I would say that not only are they cut out, they've made themselves extinct. Yet, here's the thing that I think is probably one of the more controversial things I'll say today. I think the local small business that isn't online, if they get online, could beat Amazon at its own game with voice commerce. I believe the revolution of voice commerce, voice payments, and voice-first devices will radically transform, because physics always wind up winning in the end. Physics means whoever's closer to you wins.
We've seen stuff like Amazon Echo, right? So it sits on your kitchen table. You tell it when you need to add something to the grocery list or ask it a question from Wikipedia or whatever. But that's kind of fine in a relatively static environment. So how does it work in the real world? I don't know. Can you pay for your coffee at Starbucks? Can you order pizza? Can you communicate with retailers on the go?
Well, there's an interesting concept. We're so infantile in this revolution that a lot of it's going to be written literally as we speak today. So many stealth startups, so many inventive and geniuses. Most of them are younger than 23. Usually when you get into your 30s and you've been around AI long enough, you've been a crotchety old person and it's never going to get there, And I have some 18-year-olds that are just wildly crazy about inventing around this. So today, at this moment, I can say, order me a pizza. Now, this is not Amazon skills. It's stuff that I've built. Now, when I say order me a pizza, it's doing a big decision tree. It's one of my voice systems there. The decision tree is, what was the pizza I got last time? How long ago was it? Do I want the same place? What is the logistics of getting it to me? Who can get it to me faster? How many people are in my house right now? Do I have guests? It's looking at my schedule. What are their dietary needs? They're looking at maybe social signals. This is a lot. It does. In one order me a pizza. And then it solves all these things and says, well, Felipe's Pizza is a good choice. How does that sound? Literally, that's the dialogue. Sounds good. Order it. Okay, I'll pay with it on your Citibank credit card.
Okay, so that payment though, what does that require? Is this kind of like voice authentication, like biometrics, or is it something different?
Now we're getting into the minutia of where I'm trying to get some intellectual property. Okay. So I got to be very careful. So the biggest problem right now is I can run into your house and yell to Alexa, and I can say, order my buddy 97 diapers and run out of your house overnight, please. Make those adult diapers extra large. You know, it's funny, my children were having a Saturday morning spat, and he called my older son called my younger son Poopy Pants, and you need new I think it was SpongeBob underwear. So he ordered him 10 dozen SpongeBob underwear from Amazon, and they showed up at my front door. So that gives you an example of what can go on. So obviously, we know that model is flawed, right? So some people say, well, there'll be authentication. Not the way you think. Not a voice prints? Nah, probably not. Maybe in ways you don't think. 89, I started really thinking about this idea. And let me just say there are 12 ways to solve this. 5 of them I think are profoundly important, and they will open up voice to a level that we've never dreamed of. And I'll give you some hints on that. And that is making a voice-first system, not a community-based system, from its onset is a mistake. And where I believe the voice-first system should be is like an electrical outlet. I got to be metaphorical here. And that your intelligent agent and your intelligent assistants, you'll have many. 10 years from now, I promise you will. You have about 20, 30 of them. They'll all be doing different things, and they'll all talk to each other, and they'll talk to the other things. I call this the abstraction layer. The abstraction layer is with you at all times. It's your identity, it's your personality, and it's your sovereignty. And that will interact with the utility that we call a voice-first device, whether it be Alexa, Siri, Cortana, Watson, Viv, Samsung. It doesn't matter. That's not what these designers think, though. If you go to Viv and you go to Siri and, oh, no, this will be your intelligent assistant. I believe that they're absolutely flawed, very much like IBM was flawed when Steve Jobs said, I'm going to put a computer on everybody's table. The intelligent assistant will become the PC revolution, and that's where the innovation will be, in that abstraction layer between you and your voice-first devices. And so that's where the secret is. That's where the innovation and the next Googles are going to be invented and created. I have absolutely no doubt about that.
So we hear a lot said about Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, Android Pay, these kind of various systems owned by device manufacturers who are effectively looking to own the top level of the stack. And I guess a lot of people are excited about not only how those can be used, especially things like Apple Pay as it becomes integrated into websites online. Do we move away from a hardware manufacturer, device manufacturer owned system, or the likes of Apple, Samsung, Google looking into how they should be incorporating this into future iterations of their systems?
These are really interesting questions. Well, very complex, actually. I could probably spend hours on it. AirPods are Apple's very first voice-first device. It was built with that premise in mind. It was a sub rosa premise. Most people aren't going to get it until it's already out there.
So this is what eventually all you have is the AirPods. You don't have the phone anymore.
Well, what happens is your device becomes irrelevant. This is a challenge of everybody. This is what disruption is about. what becomes of the device in a voice-first world? Where is it? And when screens are just situational and your true interaction with a computer is not this hierarchical, icon type point and click, which is fine for a lot of things, but it's not going to be what you and I mostly are going to be using computers for. We're going to be using computers to find out things, to confirm things. I can go on with what really we use computers for. We spend more time mechanically and cognitively getting at what we want to know, which is usually a yes or a no answer. And we think that that's using a computer, and that's the ridiculousness. And that's the mechanics of trying to get around a ridiculous user interface. And it's only there, it's ridiculous because the computer couldn't understand us. And once they understand us, the user interface becomes irrelevant. It's a voice interface. It's us having what we're having right now, a dialogue. And that dialogue ultimately will do away with hardware as we know it. Now, will screens still matter? Yes, they'll be ephemeral. Sometimes literally ephemeral. They'll pop up in front of us. We can see the beginnings of that within augmented reality. Voice first is augmented reality, and it's just not sounding as sexy as visually augmenting reality, but it is nonetheless augmented. It's an overlay to your world. It's informing you in a profound way. And that's what AirPods are. AirPods are the beginning of an augmented reality system. This is going to be visual augmented reality, of course. I'm not saying visuals going away. I'm not necessarily saying keyboards are going to go away. I'm not saying, devices that you hold are gone. But I'm going to say you're going to be using those devices a lot less. You're going to be using them in different ways. And instead of typing, you're going to present ideas and the computer will do it for you. Like, unfortunately, even your own writing. You probably say, I want to compose a story about, like this morning, I wrote about Alfred Beach, right? Nobody knows who Alfred Beach is. We all should know who he is. But history wasn't kind to creative thinkers. Alfred Beach created the first pneumatic tubes underneath New York City. He was doing this in 1870. And he did it with his own money, and he did it secretly. He dug these holes. He made it work secretly. Finally, a newspaper exposed him for the charlatan that he is. How dare he? Experts came out of the woodwork. How dare he do this? I'm a locomotive expert. You can't run this. It's not safe. I'm a structural engineer expert. This is not structurally strong. Buildings will compress on it. You can't build underground. So what did they do? They made the elevated L, and they made the eyesore of New York City, because it didn't conform to the experts at the time. So we had to wait for Elon Musk to bring back the pneumatic tube that Alfred Beach didn't invent. He literally executed and invented around the idea of pneumatics. And that's where we are today. I mean, the infrastructure of Google and Apple, Facebook, all of these different systems are built around certain premises. Apple is built on the premise of selling you hardware and software. Google is on the premise of selling you advertising, and so is Facebook. I mean, that's it. You get other things along with it, obviously. It's great value, but these are advertising models. If advertising is no longer going to be there and your voice interacting assistants and agents are going and doing things for you, in your social networks, for example, it'll look around and say, this is what's going on, summarize it, and give you what you really were looking for that day. And how does it do that? An intelligent assistant will sit on your shoulder and follow you for 6 months to a year. It really doesn't need more than that. Then it just knows your behaviors. And then it anticipates those behaviors proactively. This is a big thing. Everybody says, I got to remember all these commands. It's going to be so hard. I'm like, no. Proactivity is where all of this solves itself. And of course, interactive learning, things are going to continue to learn. Alexa doesn't learn, really. I mean, you got to teach it a skill. That's not learning. I should be able to learn it. Yeah. I should be able to teach it like my children. Say, okay, this is how it works. Give me that again. Oh, yeah, this is how it works. And then it builds a neuron. It's that simple. So you and I are going to be computer programmers. This does not make the priesthood very happy. Right? Because the priesthood, and I'm one of those. I mean, I'm part of the elite priesthood. I program, I'm a technologist, I'm a 1%er snob of technology. But the common person will program their own systems, their own intelligent agents. It will bypass worse than any ad blocking software ever could the machinations of people that want to try to inject advertising.
Brian, I want to ask you about another news item that throws some of this into relief. Uber has been rolling out cash payments in some cities over the past few months, which, though surely practical, is almost counterintuitive to the ethos of Uber. And so many people have been excited about the way Uber structures payments in a silent, hidden, intuitive way within the experience. And you hear so much commentary about the way that customer experience is likely to go into the future, whereby the actual payment isn't necessarily an overt action anymore. But Uber, for whatever reason, is to an extent at least seemingly backtracking on this. What explains that move, and is it a good one?
Well, it's counterintuitive to most people in the tech world. So is M-Pesa in South Africa, in Africa. You take a step back and you have to look at humanity. And again, this is a common theme in all the work I do, is you really need to understand the humans that are going to use these systems. Everything from, things that Square does, things that Stripe does, things that PayPal does, things that Zoom does, things that Uber does. All of these companies, unfortunately, at times, you need to take in the humanity approach. What is somebody using the system for? What do they have to gain by it? And in the case of Uber and Cash, they're realists, and that's what makes Uber so successful. They looked at the market empirically, and they took a step back and said, we don't need to move that rock up the hill. Our rock up the hill is not to get people to use electronic payments. Our rock up the hill is to get logistics to work in this particular region, and to get this logistical system currently moving people, but in the future moving a whole lot of other things, because that's all all Uber is a logistics and payments company, period. And what you wind up doing with that is the grand prize. And they looked at it and they said, in this particular biome, if we tried to push electronic payments, it's not going to work. And there's a lot of philosophical and societal and political reasons for that. So they went with what worked. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're going to see a lot of that going on with companies that sustain. Companies that don't sustain will try to change behavior, and they think that that's the reason for them to exist. And they say, look at Steve Jobs. He changed behavior. That's not at all what Steve did. Steve understood the human being and built around that human being and gave them things that they didn't think they needed, but they ultimately would when they finally got to touch it. That's true creativity. But saying, a bunch of engineers sitting around in a circle say, well, we can build an algorithm to make this easier. It's not going to fix the problems of the human being. And so you start with the problem you need to solve, and it has to be an objective, real problem. And you have to look at that problem from every possible angle. Then you take all that research, tear it up, forget it, and then go out in the field and empirically research it, empirically study it, and then really observe, then come back and synthesize and build something new. That's the only way you're going to solve any problem when it comes to finance, comes to banking, things of that level. And I think that's why banks are at a quagmire today in history. The millennials don't want to go to a bank. What? This has been true for the last 200 years. Nobody likes going into a bank. I've never known anybody that loves going into a bank other than bankers. And bank robbers at times, right? But human beings don't like going to get their teeth pulled, go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, maybe the post office, and the bank. And these are institutions. And what happens is people revile at the fact of being in an institutional type of setting. That's a reality. And we keep rediscovering this every 10 years. And reporters wind up saying this generation is different. They're not going to go into banks. And they said the same thing when the ATM machine came up. This generation's different. And it's a continuity of the way humans deal with technology. And the ones that get it really thrive. The other ones,
it's interesting.
Survive.
There's some interesting social implications there, because if parts of the world are maybe more automated, more interesting in using debit cards, credit cards to pay, and are moving towards this voice first world that you're describing, and other parts are relatively well set in the cash paradigm. You could potentially see
let's look at the telephone line. I know where you're going here. Let's look at the telephone. I remember at one time scientists and economists got together at a symposium, and they said, copper mining is going to wind up exploding, because when we finally wire up every home in India and every home in China with a copper wire for a telephone, because of course they're going to get a telephone, and then we wire them up for some kind of cable TV service, of course it's going to be a wire. These people, there are going to be a lot of holes dug, so ditch diggers are going to be a lot of needs for that. There's going to be a whole lot of needs for copper wire and all the plastic shielding and et cetera. That was, 1970s. Even the 1980s, you can look at some futurists talking about how many wires are going to be put in there. Yet there are generations of individuals that will never get a copper wire running to their home. It's going to come to them wirelessly. The same is true. So they leapfrog over technology, and everybody thinks that they're going to transgress exactly like the Western world did, a developing world, for example. And I'm saying, no, that's not the case. I think they're going to leapfrog. In fact, there's evidence from some of the stealth companies I'm dealing with, particularly in India, for example, that voice commerce might wind up leapfrogging there faster than in other parts of the world. And perhaps even in Africa with some of the companies I'm seeing. There's a lot of reasons for that I can go into, but I don't know if there's enough time. But I think we must always remember that nothing happens in a linear setting. We like to believe that, and ex post facto, as historians, we might look back and say, okay, I see the linear connection. That's not really what happened. These are juxtapositions upon different individual creativities that took place in the market. And some of those bets were, there was money behind them. And some of those bets, they took the money away from the guy, and he went away and cried, hid, killed himself sometimes, that's a history of invention. Some win and some lose, and it's not always the best idea, the best invention. Albert Beach is a good example. If pneumatic tubes were allowed to be built in New York City, you and I would already be going coast to coast in any part of the world through pneumatic tubes underground. There's no doubt in my mind. It was an incredible technology, and it was scalable. But this never happened because...
I wonder why they didn't take off anywhere else.
They tried it in England, actually, before Albert Beach, and there's a whole lot of reasons. I could tell you one of them was, this is going to sound very prosaic, the merchants that were on top of Broadway didn't like the fact that people were going to get from one side of Broadway to the other without passing by their stores. So they called up their local politician and said, we mustn't have any of this. And then out of the woodwork came experts, and out of the woodwork came debunkers. Look today. Look how many experts and debunkers there are in any industry, any field. I was going to say, so not dissimilar to the way the world still works. No, every time somebody says, and I wrote a piece about the iPhone becoming ceramic, I got debunkers and experts coming out of every possible nook and cranny saying, that's an impossibility, Brian. How dare you? You're a charlatan. Stop it. And I'm like, well, okay, whatever. We'll see. Time tells. They said the same thing about Apple being involved in payments. I said in 2010, I walked around to the disruptive payment companies in the Silicon Valley. I go, listen, guys, if you're going to create a new way to pay, understand that the landlord is going to come back and claim their land. So our little beach party we're having here at the beach, they're going to come and build a resort here, and they're going to let us have our beach party, but everybody's going to go to the resort because they got a really cool infinity pool. And that resort is Apple, and it's going to be Apple Pay. So your way to pay is going to be a nice subtext in history, but it is not going to dominate. And I hate saying that. I don't want to say that to anybody, but if you ask me to be a realist, that's what's going to happen. Now, if you knew that in 2010, what magic could you have brought to the world if you built around it? Nobody did. Let's take the Wright brothers, for example, right? The experts and the debunkers at the time, the aeronautical engineers, the scientists, a lot of them history wants to forget, but there were thousands of them. That these individuals are insane. They're funny. They're never going to conquer the air. The aeronautical engineers said so, and they said so with a vehemence. And so what happened? Well, on that fine day in Kitty Hawk, there were 3 people on that hill. Actually, 4 people, I'm sorry. There were the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Oliver, and there were 2 kids who were crazy kids. That's what the newspaper reporter said they were, because they actually believed that these bicycle mechanics were going to fly. And so they helped them carry the plane up there. And the newspaper reporter was a cameraman also, and he was going to record on film the death of one of the Wright brothers. That's literally what he was there for, snorkeling the entire time. Yet, what happened that day? They took to flight, and they proved the debunkers, they proved the experts absolutely wrong. And of course, that was an outlier. That was only just 3 seconds or 10 seconds. They couldn't sustain flight. And yeah, sure enough, they came back and they sustained flight. And it went on and on until where we are today. So we have to understand that that's where all innovation comes from. And at this particular moment in time, it has never been worse. It has never been worse. Here we are seeing modern technology coming right in front of our face magically. And every time somebody comes up with something that this is outside the crab pot, somebody pulls you in and says, no, you can't do that. No, I'm an expert. I've been doing this for 35 years. You can't do that. And what they're saying is they can't do that. It's humanity. That's what humanity does. We're frail. Our egos and our emotions pull us back. We're afraid to know what's over that hill. And there's the people like the Wright brothers or Alfred Beach. I mean, Alfred died lonely and poor, penniless, because he built a subway underneath Broadway because he thought it was going to fix the stench of urine and horse manure and mud and dirt in 1870 on Broadway. He wanted it to be clean, but it didn't fit in his time. So that's where we are in payments right now. See, and advertising and the infrastructure that's built it, right? You have all of these entities that potentially could lose massively.
Yeah. Brian, but before we go, I have to ask you one last question. You were a student of legendary mathematician John Nash at Princeton. What was that like?
Yes. You know, it's interesting. I use the word student out of respect for him. At the time I got to meet John Nash, I was just a kid bumming around Princeton, and everybody told me I got to sit in on one of these lectures. And John, at that time, there was no movie called The Beautiful Mind. Nobody knew this. Listen, I met people who who wore pajamas most of the day, who had beards down to their belly buttons, and they worked at AT&T as a scientist researcher or the Institute of Advanced Study or Princeton. You'd see these people, and they were geniuses. And I would beg for minutes with these folks just to hear their views of the world, because they were probably 300 years ahead of us. John was one of those, and a group of my friends said, let's go in here and check out the lecture. Everybody's going in. He wasn't an official professor. They were humoring him at that time. They actually were feeling very sorry for him. So he was giving lectures, and they were within the hall, and they were phenomenal. And I got to meet with him. And during his lectures, he was so animated, so incredibly powerful. I took a girlfriend. It was not even the math. And they were transfixed in one of his lectures about what he saw game theory was really about. And it was so exotic because it was not rational math the way we knew it. You know, I was learning differential calculus, and here's this guy talking about what essentially is a form of chaos theory and of humans. And so he's an animated soul, but you know, whenever he stopped, he would go inside of himself, and he was a very, very lonely individual. I would see him walk across the campus every now and then. He would be sometimes apparently talking to himself. Again, I didn't know his brain, elements, whatever we deem it today. I thought it was a man reasoning out his sub and conscious mind with thoughts he had, because he was an incredibly brilliant genius. I mean, I can't even put in words, but literally consumed in his waking hours with all sorts of ideas.
You have a great podcast called Around the Coin, which all of our listeners should absolutely subscribe to, check out. You and your co-host get into some really interesting topics, and I imagine, kind of based on my experience podcasting, that's been really powerful for you.
Yes, it has. It's allowed me to connect not only with my co-hosts who are just dear friends. I mean, we talked pre-show. Some of our pre-shows run for 4 hours. So, and we just talked about.
One of your co-hosts has been on my podcast, Faisal Khan.
Faisal's brilliant. He's just really a treasure. So's Mike. They have their own unique perspectives. We threw this together, and we have so many listeners that support us. I have people giving me feedback, and we've taken a bit of a tilt away from some of the finance and got a little more esoteric. I think it's probably more necessary now at the moment in time that we are in to try to take a few steps back. But it's allowed me to connect. I'm notoriously a private person, as much as that is funny. I mean, I only recently started using Twitter. I've had an account since, I think, 2010. I didn't really use it. And I definitely use Quora, but I use Quora more to learn. I mean, I feel like it's the Library of Alexandria. If you go back in history and understand what that was, there's so many brilliant minds. I feel like, oh my God, I got to give something back to this. I don't know what I can give, some of my knowledge, but I learned so much. I feel like I've gotten 3 PhDs, maybe 10 PhDs from all the brilliance that I found on Quora. Quora has become notorious with some people, especially some academics. They abandon it because those wackos are on there, but some of the really good academics are there, and they're exposing new sciences and new technologies, new ways of thinking that I don't think we would otherwise know. And some of it gets into proper academic papers. Some of it is just pure theory. Some of it's science fiction, just like the robot was science fiction, the computer.
It's great stuff, and I love your contributions there.
I really appreciate it.
Brian Roemmele, thank you so much for joining us today. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work and to connect with you directly?
My first and last name at Twitter or at Quora.
So that's BrianRoemmele. That's
right. And please reach out to me. I don't care what you have to say. As far as I'm concerned, you got something important to tell me, and that's why I'm out there.
Brian, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Will. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.